because the woman who was going to introduce my friend Sandy Fortenberry is not here. She's over at the Ambassador Forum. Sandy and I have another project that we work on with the Lubbock County Historic Commission. She's the chair of it and native from Lubbock. We worked together with the city for this long, it seems like that. And now I have the opportunity to work with her on the Lubbock County Historical Commission. So I had asked Sandy to come and do this presentation, and she said yes. So welcome to Ollie.
Thank you, Peter. Does anybody know the significance of today's date? March 10th.
The day after my sister's.
No, that's not it. Okay.
I didn't think anybody'd know either. I had to come up with something.
The election to organize Lubbock County was held on March 10th, 1891. Now, the county had been formed earlier in 1886, and this election was to form the government, okay? And after some negotiating, which is another story, Lubbock was determined to be the county seat of the county with the new government. At that time, the population of Lubbock County was fewer than 300 people. And before that was the prairie. Then it was crossed by Indian trails, army routes, and trader tracks. The plains attracted settlers, the ranchers, followed by the farmers. The selling of school lands, which is a whole other story, and the availability of relatively cheap land drew others. By the turn of the century, Lubbock County was dotted with small communities. Today, perhaps only a name is reminiscent of where people once worked and lived. The community names usually reflected the primary settler: Beckton, Peckville, Hardy, Schroeder, Foster. Other community names reflected the geography: Badger Lake, Broadview, Canyon, Midway, County line. So, have you heard of any of these?
Yeah.
Heard of some of them? Okay. Okay. All right. Somebody dropped all my papers. How embarrassing. A good person would have looked at all this. A better person would have it all memorized. And the printer might have put them out in order. So bear with me here. All right, so you've heard of some of these towns. That's good. We'll talk about some of them. I'm glad that they're not totally forgotten because many of them have passed into history and are largely forgotten. Two things triggered my interest. Okay, there we go. In small towns, other than growing up in one. Peter, you might tell people I am from Lubbock, but I actually grew up in New Deal. All right, so that's the small town I grew up in. About 1986, Lubbock County Historical Commission, with mostly Dr. Robert Carr, put together a map of Lubbock County showing the ghost towns, those forgotten towns. And in 2005, the Lubbock County South Plains Genealogical Society published Lubbock Now and Then by Yvonne Perkins. And it's a compilation of items about Lubbock small towns. Most of these towns don't show up on maps, on early maps anyway. This 1907 postal map of Lubbock County indicates 3 towns with post offices: Acuff, Slide, and Grovesville. And Grovesville wasn't even on a marked road, as you can tell. Michael A. Cuff came to the South Plains about 1891 and settled 10 miles east of the town of Lubbock. His brother Mark settled with him. A school at A. Cuff was started in 1902 with 13 students. 7 of them were A. Cuff kids. J.J. Dillard established Lubbock's newspaper, the Avalanche, in 1900. He was a genius with marketing skills to sell newspapers. In addition to reporting the news and promoting his hometown, Dillard enlisted correspondents from communities to write columns. The Avalanche was the Facebook of its day. A. Cuff was written about by Happy Jack. I wish I knew who Happy Jack was. He reported on A. Cuff for almost a decade. These articles give glimpses of daily life, and similar happenings can be traced and connected throughout the county's communities, and they almost all had a column in the Avalanche. Here, Happy Jack writes about Sunday school, Mother's Club, the Prohibition, the Prairie Dog election, for or against, and who visited who. Let me read you a poem. When asked to describe how the town of Slide got its funny name, folks quickly replied, the surveyor screwed up, and when we discovered the lie, we all just slid over and became known as Slide. Do you know that story? In 1900, W.P. Florence filed on school land in Block 20, 13 miles southwest of the town of Lubbock. Yes, that Florence, who grew the first bale of cotton in Lubbock County in Slide, and he moved to Slayton in 1911. In 1903, surveyor W.D. Sandifer, whose name will go down in infamy, discovered that most of Block 20 structures had been built a mile or so east of their proper locations. To rectify the error, all the community's buildings, 2 schoolhouses, a post office, and 6 family homes with barns, windmills, and fences were placed on skids and slid to the west. And henceforth, Block 20 was referred to as Slide. Now, this is not a unique phenomenon. It happens throughout, and you can read about it. Barton site, which I'm sure you've never heard of, in Hale County, got slid over to Abernathy when it lost the railroad. Gomez in Terry County did the same thing to Brownfield. So you'll see that recurring throughout South Plains history. The Slide School District was established in 1901 and is often referred to as the county's first rural school. If you could read the very fine print down at the bottom of this picture, that's what it says. That same reference talks about a school in Estacada in 1882, the Canyon School in 1892, and Center in 1899. They didn't even do their own fact checking and writing their own reference. So it's kind of up to grad what was first, right? There is still a church in Slide, and currently the Slide Plant Market and a chemical company, but not much else. But mostly, people think Slide Road only goes to the mall and not to a town. Or they pass through Slide nowadays on their way to New Home. Grovesville, another one on the map with the post office. George Oliver Groves came to Lubbock County in 1890 and located on Section 27, land purchased from the state, about 10 miles northwest of the town of Lubbock, where today Farm to Market 1294 and County Road 1900, which would be North Slide, intersect. He started a town called Ophir. Ophis from the Bible refers to the source of Solomon's gold. And he was the first postmaster in 1904. The town and post office were renamed Grovesville in his honor by him in 1905. The postal service was discontinued in 1912. There was a series of school buildings in Grovesville, from that framed one-room school to a brick building with an auditorium built in 1928, but never much else. Groves had hoped the railroad would come through Grovesville, but it went east through Monroe, another theme that you see happening. Despite its objections of wanting to go with shallow water, Grovesville consolidated with New Deal School in 1935. Retired New Deal Superintendent Jimmy Nolan erected his house, and this is an aerial view of that, on the former site of the Grovesville School, and kept turning up bricks as he built. So if you need an antique built brick from the Grovesville School, I have one, he may have it. The prospect of a railroad coming to Lubbock sparked more development. This Santa Fe map of 1908 indicates with dotted lines proposed train tracks. Land promoters with names like Littlefield, Abernathy, Seagraves wanted town sites, train depots, and new citizens. Railroads offered excursions with free fares to potential land buyers, free only if you bought a lot, I believe. The railroad put a siding or a switch about every 6 miles of track for trains to pull up to a depot or to pass another train. Some places, like Shallowater, Monroe, and Idalou, were successful in securing depots, but other communities grew up near switches, also called stations. And although you'll hear station and depot used interchangeably, stations are places, depots are buildings. Lubbock County by 1914 possessed train lines, Santa Fe lines, radiating in 4 directions, and the city itself was boasting of being the hub city. That's where it started. As early as 1914. This Santa Fe map, from its 1915 brochure promoting land and range train travel, indicates switches with white dots. So if you see the white dots, that's a switch about every 6 miles along the track. Some of the switch names have been lost to history. Years later, the highways followed the train tracks, and we recognize some of those names of forgotten towns that sprang up around the switches. Now, I put a sign of Burris. Anybody know where the Burris switch is today? Burris switch is, because it's right there, I took that picture, on Spur 331, which we also call Southeast Drive. And if you go over the railroad crossing, you go to the Lubbock Stockyards. You got a picture? Okay. These switch signs are fast disappearing. Trains are becoming automated and computerized, and you just don't find them by all those little towns anymore. They are disappearing. So if we start at the north, because the railroad came from Amarillo, Canyon City, and Plainview to Lubbock. So we can trace that first rail line, and the first dot you might see is Abernathy. It is misplaced because Abernathy is not inside the Lubbock County line. It is split in Hale County and Lubbock County at 5th Street. So the map maker was off just a little bit here. Okay. So if we follow these highways that we know today, we're going to talk about some of these other switches in town. So Monroe, not Grovesville, got the railroad. Frank Bowles, B-O-W-L-E-S, not to be confused with Rancher, B-O-L-E-S, and at least 18 land companies advertised in the Avalanche during 1909. Dillard was breaking in advertising money, I think. Monroe Abernathy, a railroad agent, had traveled the area obtaining right-of-way for new train lines. Molly Abernathy, Monroe's wife, was invited to name 2 towns on the Pecos and Northern Tract. Molly chose Abernathy and Monroe to be namesakes for her husband. Frank Bowles platted the property, and the map shows that town site with little plots that you could buy your own lot. He built a store, he advertised, had a barbecue, I think, or an open house to come see where the town was going to be. But those lots were never really built on. The town of Monroe grew, but it grew west of the railroad tracks, and the train depot was on the east side of the railroad tracks. The depot was in the town side of Monroe, but everybody else built on the other side of the tracks for whatever reason. With the county school consolidation in 1935, the new rural high school number 3 was named New Deal. What period of time was it? 1935. And its counterpart to the east was named Roosevelt. In the consolidation of all the county schools, Roosevelt and New Deal were the only ones to get new names. Everybody else kept the town name. But there was no town at Roosevelt. It was equidistant between Acup, Midway, and those that they consolidated. Right? So for about 15 years, the community of Monroe had New Deal School, all located at Route 3, Lubbock. When the post office was established in 1945, 1949, guess what? There was already a Monroe, so they took the name New Deal from the school, and that's how Monroe became New Deal. That was a fact that bothered me for years. I've asked the story, and no one could tell me. So while I was doing the research for the historic marker, that was one of my burning questions. And I found the answer, how Monroe became New Deal with the post office. But the rest of the story is this. The original town of Monroe ceased to exist in 1946, 3 years before the post office. W.O. Fortenberry, name might sound familiar, owned the southwest quarter of Section 28, the original platted Monroe town site, where his gin was. He petitioned the Lubbock County Commissioners to cancel the Monroe division. He had had some difficulties clearing up titles and lands and things like that. Because the Monroe town site subdivision was never used or cut out on the ground, Monroe was abolished by Commissioner's Court order in 1946. But New Deal is still growing. So if we go back to Lubbock, and we have the train coming down from Plainview to Lubbock, and then when it continues on to Slayton, the first switch was Burris, and the second switch, Posey. In 1908, the James B. Posey family, he was the brother of the Lubbock banker, Walter S. Posey, moved to the farm that they had purchased about 12 miles southeast of the town of Lubbock. The house they built later proved to be right in the center of the survey of the proposed railroad right-of-way. So what did they do? They jacked up the house and moved it about a mile north. The railroad established a switch where the Posey house had been and called it Posey Switch. It was later abbreviated to just Posey. Supposedly, Posey was to get the Santa Fe shop, but lost it to Slayton. Purportedly because Slayton had better water. I don't know all that story. The Posey School closed in 1950 in consolidation with Slayton, about the same time that Lubbock ISD opened the Walter S. Posey School. And if you ever Google and want to research Posey School, you have to pay attention. So the Posey Elementary School, I guess, is still in place. The Posey Community School is gone. In fact, there's not much in Posey now. Although not formally incorporated, Posey was an organized community and elected mayors during the 1930s, and they even had brick streets. All that you see there is the gin and the Emanuel Lutheran Church. The Emanuel Lutheran Church was composed largely of German immigrants lured by railroad advertising. It was dedicated on September 26, 1920, and we put a historic marker there in 2016. So if we go back visually to the train that came down, well, from Lubbock, we have another track that's following 84, going to Crosby. Okay?
That's 82.
62, 82. 84 goes to Slayton. Sorry. Okay, so 62, 82, you've got that visual. When we come out of Lubbock, then the first switch is Kendaloo. In 1910, the Crosbyton South Plains Railroad Company was chartered on April 6, 1910, and built 38 miles of track from Lubbock to Crosbyton on what is now 6282 there, I see. The first switch was Kendaloo. It was originally, the community was originally called Causey Hill before the railroad, and it was renamed in 1928, supposedly for the daughter of the vice president of the railroad, F.E. Clarity, or perhaps his nickname for his wife, or there's a story there. And there's a very similar story just down the railroad track at Idaloo, but that is somewhat substantiated that it was the two daughters of the banker, Idaloo. But Kendaloo, we're not quite sure, okay? But this switch at Kendaloo was a junction point for the Fort Worth and Denver City Railroad Company. Causey Hill, so if you're on 6282 and you look north from Kendaloo, there is a slight rise. 50 feet is not very high. My dad called it Indian Hill, but it was an early landmark in Lubbock County. It was named for bison hunters John and Thomas George Causey, who camped there briefly. So the Kendaloo switch remained a county shipping point during the 1940s and 50s, but by the 1980s it had ceased operations. During World War II, a rail spur was built from Kendaloo to the South Plains Army Airfield, which is where the Glider Museum South Silent Wings is now. So there was a rail line extended that way, but it was removed in 1950. Today, the Kendaloo Gin is a venue. It is for weddings or whatever you want to have. You can Google them and look at their Facebook. It is one of 3 gins in Lubbock County that is a venue.
Oh my God.
Slayton has one, the Tin Top, and in Carlisle, where the Carlisle Gin was, one building remains, and it's called Sophie's Place, and it is a venue. All right. So do you think people lived in these communities we've talked about? Now, there's an excerpt from the Avalanche Journal in 1944 where the county imposed fees on rental property unsuccessfully. If I just read a bit of this, it's only part of the article. They pointed out that landlords in the outlying communities of the county have not been registering their rental property as expected. he said that landlords were subject to a heavy penalty, $5,000, or a year in jail, or both, if their property is not registered by April 15th. These communities are Monroe, Beckton, Kendaloo, Shallowater, Marnell, Broadview, Pearlwood, Lyle, Dow, Hetler, Idaloo, Wolford, Burris, Balch, Slide, and Posey. All property in the county that is rented for living purposes must be registered by that day. So you don't think people live there? Well, there was enough that the county wanted a little revenue from the landlords for their property. Pearlwood. All right, now we're back to Lubbock. We're going to go west. Right? So going west in 1925, somewhat later, Santa Fe built a railroad from Lubbock to the New Mexico border at Bledsoe. Now, Bledsoe was named for the railroad president of Santa Fe. Land promoters Claude B. Hurlbut and W.M. Wood envisioned a town at a switch 12 miles on this rail line. 12 miles. So what was 6 miles west? 114, 6 miles. It was another little town. It was on the earlier map. Carlisle. We've not really forgotten Carlisle. So Carlisle, but another 6 miles out, he wanted to build a town, and they named the place with an amalgam of their names, Pearlwood. A post office opened in 1926, a gin in 1928, and a new brick high school in 1929. A newspaper ad in 1927 boasted that Pearlwood had 3 grocery stores, a feed grinding mill, and a hatchery. And about this time, there were probably 4 or 5 hatcheries raising chickens in Lubbock. In 1935, Pearlwood School was combined with the rural districts of Foster and Carlisle to form the Friendship Rural High School District. At the beginning of World War II, the Lubbock Army Airfield was built north of town. Now, in World War II, the Lubbock Army Airfield was north, and out here we had the South Plains Army Airfield, which was the glider training where the airport is now. All right? So, but the Lubbock Army Airfield was out that way. Okay. In 1949, it became Reese Air Base. Here's a trivia named for the pilot from Shallowater who was killed in the war. I forgot his first name already. Reese. Okay.
Mr.
Mr. Reese. There you go. Or sergeant or something like that. Okay. All right. Reese Air Force Base may have contributed to the growth of Pearlwood and Carlisle, but Reese was ultimately why the town disappeared. The railroad never extended past Bledsoe into New Mexico, and today is operated by the West Texas and Lubbock Rail Company, so a train still goes out that way, the Whiteface. In the early 1980s, the U.S. government decided it should have a 3,000-foot zone clear of housing at the end of its north-south runway. And what was to the south of the runway across 114? Pearlwood. Okay, so not much of Pearlwood left. If we had time, we could talk more about the founder of Pearlwood, Claude Hurlbut. He deserves a lengthier bio. He moved to Lubbock in 1917, worked at Citizens Bank, started a real estate company, owned the Tumble Inn Pool, which was the first pool in Lubbock, somewhere around where McKenzie Park is now. He invented a heater for that pool in the 20s. He founded the Lubbock Polo Club, where he played polo for 15 years. And the drawing there, I talk about you plant a town This was the town plat for Hurlwood with its streets named and all of that. So. It wasn't just the railroad that prompted the formation of communities. The opening of farmland brought in more settlers. In 1910, Lubbock had 10 land offices. Those people just didn't advertise anymore. They came to Lubbock and opened an office. And they all advertised to attract buyers of land. Now land, depending on what you read, you came to homestead, you got it maybe for nothing down or a couple of dollars, and you had 5 years to show improvements, things like that. So land was relatively cheap, and if you read those early advertisements, Lubbock was an oasis. We could grow everything. We had moderate climate. So advertising, okay? The land that the settlers came to homestead many times was native prairie. So the settlers became known as sod busters. The homesteaders broke the ground with a mule and plow. They might also have been called quarter section farmers because 160 acres was generally what they were allotted to homestead. Now imagine, if you will, a circle with a 5-mile diameter encompassing about 5 sections of land. There could have been up to 20 families settled in that vicinity on 160 acres, 1/4 of a section. Some of them might have been related, like the Acus, but everyone certainly became neighborly. Close proximity formed communities. They socialized together, they worshiped together, started a church, built a school, and maybe the community grew enough to have a store or a blacksmith shop or a gym. By the 1940s, there were almost 100 gyms in Lubbock County. And most of them had some communities around them because that's how communities grew. Abner Mcgowan Beckton was an early Lubbock County pioneer. He came to Texas in the late 1880s, saved money to buy a wagon and team, and then got into the freighting business. Trips to Estacada led him to meet a young lady, Cornelia Bryant, and they married in 1898. The couple bought land and settled in the northeast corner of Lubbock County. Beckton was neighbor to W.E. Bledsoe of the Three Circle Ranch, and the community was originally called Bledsoe, not to be confused with
Bledsoe.
yeah, okay. When applying for a post office,
Yeah.
in 1917, yep, there was another Bledsoe, so the name was changed to Beckton, after A.M. Beckton. The Fort Worth and Denver South Plains Railroad, which extended from Esteline to Lubbock, and if you go on up Caprock Canyon and the Doodlebug and the tunnel and those kinds of things. So that railroad used to pass through Beckton, but it was abandoned and the tracks were removed in 1989. For years, Beckton had the distinction of having the only bridge in the county. We paid taxes on that bridge. It was actually the railroad pass, overpass, and then you can barely see it in the corner of this photograph by the gym. So here's the farm to market road that goes under it, and here's the wooden trestle overpass. It burned in 1957 after it caught fire from the Beckton gym's burner. Beckton donated 4 acres of his land to establish a cemetery and was buried there in 1944. By 1928, we can count at least 24 rural towns in the county because there are 24 school districts named in this document. By 1934, they all had brick buildings. Every school had an auditorium, either an exclusive auditorium or one combined with a gym or with a classroom. Now, not all of them necessarily had indoor toilets and water fountains. Okay? The school was the center of community life, and these communities were not isolated. There was much going back and forth, visiting, sharing in events. But you must recognize that there were not any paved roads in Lubbock County until 1931. The fabric of each community was interwoven with its counterparts, with the same threads connecting them. The school was often the site of religious services, at least until a church was built. In 1935, Lubbock County formed those 6 rural high schools that we talked about by action of the county school board, and the majority vote of qualified voters in each high school district. And some of those local elections in those schools, Grovesville didn't want to go to Monroe, they wanted to go to Shallow Water, and there were lots of others that way that they didn't want to join the bigger school to consolidate. And some of those, if you go back and read the newspaper, some of those elections, the elections were like 20 to 14 or something like that. Not very many people voted, but that's how it ended up. And that's how New Deal and Roosevelt were built. Did you catch that I said there were 21 districts? So we're in the consolidation, and earlier I told you there were 24. Shallow Water and Idalou were independent districts and were not part of the county, but they still got caught up in some of the consolidation, and then Lubbock ISD. So that's where those things. So if you've wondered recently why Friendship, and today it's Lubbock Cooper, when I grew up it was just Cooper. If you're wondering why they have schools in the city limits, here's your answer right here. So in 1935-36, when all those elections and the consolidations came up, the Lubbock district, school district, is this square in the middle. And it has not changed in the ensuing years. So this eastern boundary is about East Loop 289. The northern boundary is Bluefield, Kent, which is almost to the airport. The western boundary is Franklin. And then the southern boundary is 98th Street. So that was the district that was set up. The city fathers, because there probably weren't many mothers found then, had decided, could not envision the growth of Lubbock. So when they divided up the consolidation, that answers your question why we've got schools, Lubbock and Cooper and Friendship schools within the city limits, because they weren't back then. The University Interscholastic League was formed in 1913 in Texas, and by 1919, Lubbock was the home site for the 20-county UIL. County schools participated in literary events like debate, declamation, spelling, and athletic events, boys and girls basketball, baseball, tennis, and later football. Here is the Slayton girls team in 1915 and the Monroe boys basket team with colors of red and black, I might mention at that time, in 1924, playing on outdoor dirt basketball courts. And note the towns on the schedule for the county basketball tournament in 1930. We've got Grovesville versus Posey, Pearlwood versus Grovesville, McClung versus Hardy, New Hope versus Foster, McClung versus Foster, Posey versus Hardy, Grovesville, New Hope. So we haven't talked about some of those, but those are forgotten towns as well. We often hear there's nothing to do in Lubbock. Heard that? That wasn't the case in the early communities. Almost every community had a home demonstration or conservation club where women learned food preparation, canning, and decorating. Texas A&M opened Experiment Station number 8 in Lubbock in 1910 to assist farmers with better agricultural methods. When A&M established a cooperative extension service in 1915, Lubbock now had a county agent and a home demonstration agent. They established boys and girls clubs, the forerunner of 4-H, and had specialty groups like the agricultural club, canning clubs, poultry clubs. In 1918, 60% of Lubbock County students were in such a club. Clubs participated in annual exhibits at the South Plains Fair, which often went to the state fair. Singing conventions were also popular. Almost every community had a group. The Lubbock County Singing Convention was held on the 5th Sunday of the month at various schools and churches, and often included dinner on the grounds. The Lubbock County Convention was member of the Panhandle Plains Convention and was host to the regional singing conventions. There was even a state convention in Lubbock in 1939 with 6,000 in attendance. W.P. Florence, publicity manager for the Lubbock County group, once bemoaned that 9/10 of the people would go further to a singing convention than to church. And it's not in our county, but there's still the Harmony Singing School and an old school located in, I just went blank. Come on. Okay. Y'all fact check me on that. Been by numerous times. Okay. I know these are small, the Lubbock County Boys and Girls Club, the Poultry Club, the Sunday School Specialist. Sunday School was a big deal, and it was primarily non-denominational. So a lot of that early on. So there was lots to do in the county if you had an interest. In a 1930 ad, Texas Utilities recognized small towns as the backbone of the South Plains. The Lubbock County communities have red dots. And we've talked about some of this. Shallow water. Remember Shallow Water got a depot? That helped. Okay. And then Grovesville. What happened to Grovesville? The railroad went east to Monroe. Acuff was a bit of a town, and down the road was the bigger town called Canyon, not to be confused with that other Canyon. And it had a big school, and the consolidation didn't help that. Airfield was an independent district. It also had a depot or a train station. Dowd was the first switch going west, and Dowd still shows up on Google if you ask, and it still might be a switch, but no sign. And if you know where the old Sam's Club is, the Kirby store right there at West Loop 289 and the Marcia Sharp interchange, that was about where Dowd was, and there was a community there. Then we've got Slide, we talked about that. Slayton is not forgotten. Estacada is forgotten and not forgotten. We talk about it a lot. Not much at Estacada anymore. And then down over here, we have Beckton. So if you look at some of these other names in the South Plains, a lot of those are forgotten. Valleyboro. Have they been to Valleyboro? I have. It's over there outside Muleshoe. Gomez, we talked about. Gomez lost in Perry County. So there are a lot of those that are listed in 1930 that are no longer in existence. The Gobles, Havengays, the Reekins, the Foods, Kavitans. When I say the Gobles, some of you may have known Rodney Goble. No? Are all gone from the community of Center, located in the northeast corner of the county. These settlers opened the school in 1899, but it closed in 1938 when students went to New Deal. What caused the demise of these Lubbock County communities? Misplaced hopes on obtaining a railroad station caused some locations not to thrive. The Depression and Dust Bowl caused an exodus from the South Plains, often to new dreams and new locations. A major factor in the decline of communities was the 1935 grouping of Lubbock County rural schools. This consolidation resulted in 6 rural high schools being formed from 20 or so smaller schools. Without a grade school, places like New Hope, Liberty, Foster, Caldwell, and Union vanished. And without a school, communities often disappeared. You can almost trace the decline. If the school goes and the post office goes, then the last to go is usually the church. And there are abandoned churches and abandoned gyms throughout the county.
Isn't there a gym in Union though?
I haven't been to Union lately. They tore the school down. I went to take a picture of it. It was gone.
We had a member of our church that used to be.
But more and more gyms are closing too. There's fewer gyms in Lubbock County because they've been consolidated as
I
well.
don't know if it's still there, but it used to be, because
Yeah.
we had our church work there.
So Marvin Looney built the Center Church. At age 97, he died this last year. The fate of the church is unknown. If you go out to the Center Church and you walk to the east, you can still trace the concrete foundation of the school and a concrete trout that was there for part of the water tower. Now that church is only a remnant of a community whose once vibrant life is gone, and Center is counted among the forgotten towns of Lubbock County. So how many of you grew up in a small town in Lubbock County? Just me? Slayton? Slayton's a smaller town once again.
The second largest town now.
So there are so many, we call them rabbit holes when we're doing research. There's so much more. We could talk about the whole history of the experiment station that came up, the railroad, how Lubbock went from old Lubbock and Monterey, things like that. So I encourage you to read the history before it is gone and forgotten. You have questions for me?
My dad used to joke about the railroad that was called the Roscoe Snyder and Pacific. I thought it was a wonderful name.
We used to drive by, there was track on both sides of the road there.
Oh,
It's a
yeah?
Joke, yeah, when we drive by, you jump in, oh, there's the Roscoe Snyder Pacific.
So this did not print out very well, and what I wrote in red, the printer didn't like, so we put it in black. But for a Sunday afternoon drive, once a month, I think, here you can find a general location of some of these towns. Of course, Google is really good, and the Handbook of Texas History, if you Google that online, will give you other types of information. So, do you have questions for me?
Sandy, another one of the projects that you are working with is the Lubbock County cemeteries.
Yes.
Did most of these smaller towns have a cemetery?
No, there are 11 cemeteries in Lubbock County. I think 2 of them are counted in Slayton. New Deal never had a cemetery. County Line has a cemetery. Now, County Line's way out on the
On the
north
county
end.
line.
Yeah. We're gonna put a historic marker up there whenever it arrives. But no, a lot of those towns didn't have their own cemeteries.
Were they buried on family land at the?
A few, but most of that has passed into obscurity there, because in Texas now, our friend's husband died, and she buried him across the street in an open lot and landscaped it and all that. But you can Google and you can find the Teal Cemetery right now because it has to be designated as such. So we've been working on getting all our cemeteries with the Texas Historic Cemetery designation. And we thought we were down to the last one. And then we heard from THC today that two of the older ones that we were calling historic were designated before they have historic markers on them, but they don't have a Texas Historic Cemetery designation because they pre-existed before that happened, so we've got to go back.
So we have two more that we've got to
Yeah, so,
submit.
yes, ma'am.
Sandy, Larry Hess had a question. He said, any more about Beckton? He said, my grandfather, J.B. Reed, was a founder along with the Becktons, Moody's, etc. Donated the land for the school.
Yes. We have a web page, and it's on Facebook. And before you tell me, I don't do Facebook. If you can look up the weather or anything on the internet, you can get to historic Lubbock County. And we just featured A.M. Beckton and with a little bit of information. And Lacey, who is with FiberMax and is also on the FiberMax Center for Discovery, and is also on the Lubbock County Historical Commission, had written an article in their magazine, The Plow, about Beckton. So there's lots of information. Off the top of my head, I don't have it.
And even though there's no Beckton anymore, it is an active cemetery. I mean, people are still being buried in the Beckton cemetery.
Yeah, and it has a historic marker. So Beckton ended up, I don't know, it came about a lot of times if someone donated land to set up a cemetery. Something else about Lubbock County Historical Commission, speaking of markers, while you're finding out where all these forgotten towns are, you might stop and see there are over 60 historic markers in Lubbock County. I don't have a map for you, but I have some addresses. So you might make a point to go look at that.
And the one in Carlisle has a giant hole through it.
We have suffered vandalism in the last 6 or 7 months with people shooting our markers. Peter has done a heroic job of repairing them. He set out with a project to refurbish them, make them shiny and black and new like before, and in doing so, he discovered. So some that had been shotgun blast in the middle, he was able to repair. The cemetery at Carlisle literally has a hole you can put your hand through. And on Sunday, I saw the V8 Ranch, which is out by Buffalo Lakes. Somebody put a hole in the center of the Texas state emblem on it. So that is a state felony, and the judge
Yes.
It's ready to say.
and,
Show me.
and he's going, so if you note any damage when you see one, if you would let somebody know, you can call the judge's office at the courthouse or Peter or me, something like that. Any other
And
questions?
those things are, a couple $1,000s a piece, so it's not,
Yeah.
not cheap to
Not their
repair.
money, apparently.
Peter can fix things, but a hole this big, he really can't do it.
Okay, we have a question. So, yes, there are several books on Lubbock County. Lubbock County Historical Commission has a larger one. Don Abbey's written some. Yeah, the ones you see at the drugstore, the Heritage Society has written one. So there are several around and available.
I just wanted to talk to you about it.
We did one, but lots of other people have done books. We some of our members contribute to Caprock Chronicles, which is that article you see in the
I love
Avalanche
that.
Journal. And we put out things on historic Lubbock County. You should check that out occasionally. I think one of the things we had the most hits on, 68,000 people somewhere saw our picture and our little article on the USS Lubbock. Did you know there was a warship in
No.
World War II named after Lubbock? And we would have people say, my dad, some relative. And just this morning, if you checked in, you would have seen about the Star Drugstore,
Yes.
one of the first drugstores. And an interesting thing about the proprietor of that, in 1910, he was arrested in violation of the local auction law, which meant he was selling medicinal whiskey in his drugstore.
But Dr. Overton had his office in the Star Drugstore also.
So there's lots of tidbits about Lubbock. We just have to be curious and look for it, and it's there.
I love it.
Anything?
I've got
Yes,
a short story, Sandy. I was in the grocery store in Tucumcari, New Mexico one day, and this little old lady in a green and white print dress and her hair pulled back in a bun came over to me as I was standing reading my shopping list and said, "Excuse me, sir, do you know anything about whiskey?" I said, "Well, I know a little bit." They had a liquor display there. So she said, "Maybe you could help me." And I said, "Well, I hope so." So I took her over there and I suggested this and no. Suggested that, no. Suggested that, no. She grabbed one off the top shelf and says, "This is just to settle my nerves."
well, unless she was top shelf instead of bottom shelf. The price goes up if you go higher. Yes, ma'am.
So the article I'm working on right now is on Alexander Williams, which was at Slide. And just to add on to the comment about cemeteries in those small communities. So M.L. Williams was one of the original settlers that got moved in the Great Slide. And he died in 1909. And they, of course, there's no cemetery there. So they actually put his body on a horse-drawn wagon and hauled him to what is now the city of Lubbock Cemetery. That was about 20 miles, give or take. All the friends and family walked behind that wagon. They walked all the way there, so then about 6 to 7 hours buried him, then turned around and walked all the way back.
Wow. And there may or not have been a road that they walked on. They might have walked across the prairie. My
There
dad,
was no real road.
My dad- as a youth driving, 10, his dad instructed him to take his friend to visit relatives at the Estacada Cemetery. And so my dad left Newville, Monroe, and just went east and let this guy direct. So there's lots of old stories about Lubbock, so be curious. I appreciate your attendance here today and being curious and wanting to know about Lubbock and its forgotten towns.
Thank you.
Can I do
I've got one more commercial, do a commercial.
I'm gonna do a little plug. I'm doing a program here next week on the 17th in the afternoon, 2 to 3:30. I'm also on the Historical Commission, and it's a program also on Lubbock history, and it's Greetings from Lubbock, a postcard history. And so we're doing, it has a lot of early real photo postcards of Lubbock and kind of intertwined with postcard history and Lubbock history. And so we'll be doing that next week.
And in partnership with Groves Library, which is on 19th Street, kind of across from LCU, we are presenting a lecture series on the second Tuesday of the month in 2022. And so last night, you missed Dr. Don Addy talking about the great airport wars, how we finally got the airport back from the U.S. government after World War II.
That's a great story.
Cindy in April will be talking about Lubbock's Woodstock. Did you know we had a peace music festival in Lubbock in 1970?
Oh, it's
There you go.
It is a great story. They decided they were gonna have all these great
Don't give it away.
Great.
Michael
people
come.
here,
Michael
and
come.
anyway, it's a great story.
So it will be at Groves Library. Now, You know, we have no, 7 o'clock, we have no advertising money, so the Lubbock Public Library puts it on their Facebook page, and we put it on our Facebook page, and it, you know, if you can Google and find that. So those are just some of the things. So check us out on Facebook on a weekly basis and look for our lecture series that's upcoming. And come see Cindy with all.
And it's Lubbock County Historical
Mhm.
Commission, that's the way.
Yeah, not to be confused with the Lubbock County, with the Lubbock Heritage Society or the West Texas Historical, so, yeah.
Our Facebook page is Historic Lubbock County.
Yeah.
That's what it's called.
Historic Lubbock.
So I thought everybody online, I've been, as y'all been talking, I've been sending the
And if any
links
of you
to
have
everybody
great
online.
pictures
Oh,
of Lubbock, give them to us before you die and your kids throw them out.
Yeah. Or before they go to the Southwest Collection, and then we'll give them.
Yeah, let us
back.
scan them before you
I
give them
think
to the
there's-
collection.
I
They'll
think,
probably keep the pictures and throw you out.
we think there's a lot of Lubbock history in shoe boxes in the back of the
Sure
closet,
is.
so go through that, because you'll be surprised what gets thrown away. We would appreciate that. We'll credit you and give it back to your. Because, yeah, the Slayton, O.D. Kenny and others have done a great job of preserving everything. Yeah. So,
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you.
There was one, there was one little place called Martin's or Marlin's or.
Marnell's, M-A-R-N-E-L, and there's still almost still, an industrial district called Marnell's Industrial
Where was
District.
that?
So that would be, you know, where the airport and Regis, it was
over
like
there.
6 miles from Monroe, if you'll get that
Okay,
far.
okay.
Erskine, somewhere in the vicinity of Erskine, maybe I didn't have.
That's
that
one I
far
just
myself.
really never heard that name ever.
Yeah. A lot of these I couldn't find any information, it's just a reference here and there.
That was great, Sandy, thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Well, thank you. Well, and there's not any place to go. All these little-
Oh, so man, you had a great view out there.
Yeah.
The water was bad.
You go to the Texas Historical Commission, they hold marks,
Come drop.
their numbers, so you can
He's long. Could I, do you have any of those handouts left over? Yes. This was fantastic. They said thank you so much. Everybody loves it. Good. Everybody's very interested. It's in community.
If anybody said, if anybody knows anything about it, please let us know.